confidando nel fatto che si uniscano altre amiche e amici. Il tema dell'incontro di questa sera è la paura di Isaac's Fear. Chiaramente davanti a questo tema possiamo pensare a tre cose: alla paura di Isaac legato sulla montagna, alla scena che si lega al termine ebraico Akedah, al libro di Isaac Lampronti, Ad Isaac, di cui ho qui una bella copia, purtroppo solo digitale, e all'oggetto concreto dell'incontro di questa sera, che non è un libro che già esiste, ma che è un libro in costruzione. Il prossimo libro di David Malkiel della Università di Barilan. Barilan è un'università, diciamo, federata, legata a Pisa da un accordo di collaborazione. In particolare David Malkiel è stato spesso a Pisa e ha dato un contributo importante anche al nostro lavoro all'interno del centro interdipartimentale di studi ebraici, e su un spazio più ampio di intervento su molte tematiche: storia della società, cimiteri ebraici, lingua e cultura ebraica in Italia. Lui è uno specialista riconosciuto nel mondo, e il tema del libro che sta facendo, legato a Isaac Lampronti, è però un tema di grande rilievo. Io non voglio dire nulla su questo, lascio subito la parola a collega Alessandra Veronese per l'introduzione dell'incontro e per l'apertura di un dialogo con David Malkiel. Voglio solo sottolineare, come abbiamo fatto anche ieri in una riunione del CISA, che al pari dell'incontro che abbiamo fatto sul libro Histoire des Juifs, dato da Piazzavi e altri qualche settimana fa, questo tipo di incontro di questo pomeriggio per noi assume un significato particolare, proprio perché non è la presentazione pure importante di un libro che esiste, ma è un momento di dialogo che aiuta e che sostiene la costruzione di un nuovo libro. Quindi per noi come centro interdipartimentale di studi ebraici essere un punto di interlocuzione, di confronto e di sostegno anche per opere che pensiamo che siano importanti è un motivo di onore, ed ecco perché siamo ben lieti e onorati di avere con noi, tanti amici e amiche che ci seguono, David Malkiel. Quindi subito la parola a Alessandra per entrare nel vivo della discussione. Bene.
Grazie Fabrizio, grazie Davide di essere qui con noi. E dunque, vabbè, giusto proprio due parole per presentare l'amico Malkiel, a parte il fatto che forse non ha tutto questo bisogno di essere presentato, ma vabbè, comunque lo presentiamo lo stesso. Vabbè, attualmente, come già accennava Fabrizio, è full professor presso l'Università di Barilan nel Dipartimento di Storia di Jewish History. Ha conseguito il suo PhD a Harvard University nel Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, e ha avuto una serie di premi, di borse di ricerca di vario tipo. Insomma, ora qui non sto a dirli tutti, ma per esempio ha avuto la Lady Davis Fellowship all'Università Ebraica, il Dinur Institute for History nel 94, ha avuto poi la Harry Star Fellowship all'Università di Harvard, e vari contributi per la ricerca, di cui l'ultimo recentissimo, perché di fatto comincia nel 2021, quindi non ha ancora cominciato, che diciamo che è stato concesso dalla Israel Science Foundation per un progetto di ricerca relativo alle Hebrew Letters from Renaissance Italy, quindi anche un tema di grande interesse per ricostruire la vita non soltanto economica, ma anche appunto culturale, sociale, familiare, religiosa e quant'altro degli ebrei italiani in quella che potremmo definire il lungo rinascimento, cioè diciamo il Renaissance inteso all'anglosassone. E dunque, ripeto, non mi sto tanto a dilungare perché il curriculum è lunghissimo, idem il numero delle pubblicazioni, che non avrebbe senso qui ora ricordare tutte. Come già accennava Fabrizio, ricordo che David Malkiel appunto è professore all'Università di Barilan, università che anche proprio attraverso Davide, attraverso un altro collega, Michael Risic, un altro caro amico, insomma, che è venuto a Pisa, è in questo momento legata a noi con un programma cosiddetto KA107, cioè una specie di Erasmus Mundus, insomma un programma di scambio che non appena appunto finito questo malefico coronavirus, io sono già pronta col braccio per farmi vaccinare, consentirà sia ad un certo numero di studenti e di docenti di Barilan di passare dei periodi in Italia e di conseguenza poi consentirà anche ad alcuni studenti e docenti di Pisa di trascorrere dei periodi appunto in Israele. Allora, venendo invece al tema di oggi, ecco, io anche d'accordo con Davide e con Fabrizio, più che una vera appunto e propria presentazione, approfitto della presenza dell'autore per fargli una specie di piccola intervista con 3 domande su cui poi eventualmente tutti potranno evidentemente intervenire, interloquire, insomma, in modo tale da consentire sia una presentazione di questa opera ancora, diciamo, che ancora deve essere realtà in qualche misura, cioè nella sua versione inglese, e poi appunto permettere a David di ragionare un po' più distesamente su quelli che sono e continuano a essere alcuni dei suoi interessi di ricerca, alcuni dei quali collegati in modo decisamente molto stretto con il nostro PRA, cioè con questo progetto di ricerca di Ateneo coordinato dal collega Fabrizio Franceschini, e altri contributi viceversa, magari meno relativi, cioè meno connessi al PRA, ma sicuramente connessi a quello che è lo studio sia del mondo ebraico-italiano, anche negli suoi aspetti materiali. Tra l'altro ricordo che una delle opere più importanti di David Malkiel è quella relativa ai cimiteri ebraici di Padova, è un lavoro veramente enorme, fondamentale, che noi speriamo possa poi servirci, anzi speriamo che ci serva quanto prima anche per procedere con un lavoro analogo sul cimitero ebraico di Pisa e possibilmente anche di Livorno e di Pitigliano, dove siamo stati ormai sembra un secolo fa, ma insomma ci siamo stati a settembre del 2019 insieme a Brenda, sua moglie, abbiamo fatto questa gita a Pitigliano e insomma è stato molto bello, molto interessante. Allora, la prima domanda che vorrei porre a Davide è la seguente: quali sono state le ragioni che ti hanno spinto a raccogliere questi saggi in un unico volume e qual è, a tuo avviso, il filo conduttore che appunto collega questi vari saggi, no? Perché se uno va a vedere l'indice, in effetti trova cose anche, come posso dire, molto diverse, no? Le une dalle altre. Quindi questa è un po' la prima domanda, cioè se ci parli della genesi di questo progetto e appunto del perché questa scelta, perché questi saggi e non ad esempio altri, e insomma, prego.
Rispondo in inglese?
Sì, certo, è più semplice.
Grazie. I would like to start by explaining what this project means to me and what it has meant to me. And first, I will start with a story of my entry into this area. When I wrote my dissertation at Harvard on the politics of the Jewish community of Venice in the early 17th century, which is, of course, no longer the Renaissance, but certainly at that time, in the late 20th century, the Renaissance is what everyone was studying. And even when they spoke about the Jews of Italy, it was always about the Rinascimento. When I finished my dissertation, by coincidence, I received an invitation by a leading scholar of Talmud named Israel Tashma of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He called me up on the telephone to ask me if I would contribute to a volume he was preparing about the history of Jewish law in the modern period. And this volume was to be structured geographically. And he asked me if I would write the chapter on Jewish law in Italy in the modern period. So I gave him the only possible answer, which was that I know nothing about the subject. He was not surprised or disappointed because apparently no one knew anything about the subject. I was hardly the first person he approached. Having just completed my PhD, I thought this might be an interesting new direction for me, not so much the Jewish law aspect as the modern period aspect. And I accepted the invitation, and I spent the next 6 months studying this subject and writing a fairly extensive survey of the material. What was important about this experience was that it completely changed my evaluation of what we call today the early modern period. In those days, this term was not so commonly in use. In fact, studies of the history of Italy, not only the Jews, but in general, studies of the history of Italy in the Baroque, in the 17th century, in the 18th century, this period was usually referred to by the archaic term la decadenza, the period of decline following the Renaissance. And certainly in Jewish history, the same was true. There are a few famous figures who most people had heard of, Luzzatto, Zacuto, but very few. For the most part, the intellectual leaders in Italy among the Jewish people were unknown. And if you speak about the social history of the Jews of Italy, usually one could only point to Livorno, which was certainly a success story in the 17th century, but this was considered the exception to the general decline among Italian Jewry. So when I began my study, it was sort of like if you visit a museum or an archive or a library, and you notice there's a door in the far corner, and you, out of curiosity, you push open the door, and you see that you've entered into an enormous room full of books that nobody knew existed, and nobody read them or studied them or heard of them. And I was amazed. And I realized that we were suffering from a cultural bias and a distortion of the historical record. For in fact, there was a great deal of activity, of intellectual life. Italy was a vibrant country with many exciting thinkers and writers, scholars, poets, and so forth. This has been the first step in what I've been doing since then in different ways, studying the culture, the heritage, the legacy of the Jews of Italy in the early modern period. Isacco Lampronti, Rabbi Yitzchak Lampronti, and his encyclopedia, Pachad Yitzchak, Fabrizio referred to it as Paura di Isacco. In fact, in some texts from the period, it's Timore, which is, I understand, the same thing. And for me, Pachad Yitzchak has come to epitomize the creativity among the Jews of Italy in the early modern era. This is the first significance of the project for me. But there is more. I will talk a minute about, soon I will talk about some aspects of this man's life and career, but now I will just mention what everyone knows, that he was not only a rabbi, he was also a physician and therefore a scientist. And his book, Pachad Yitzchak, also epitomizes a theme that has run down through Jewish history from the ancient period to the present, which is the relationship between religion and science, or the common expression, faith and reason. This was a typical medieval expression. And it is an issue that is still with us, very much with us, in the 21st century. Examples are well known. On the level of doctrine or theory, we are all still very much facing the challenge of understanding the relationship between the latest scientific theories. By now, Darwin is not the latest, but still the doctrine of evolution and its challenge to biblical religion, to belief in creation. This is just a very famous, not very new example of this challenge. But the challenge is not only in terms of substantive issues, in terms of doctrines and specific ideas. It's also a more fundamental challenge. It is a challenge on the level of epistemology. The challenge is how to reconcile rationalism as a methodology, the use of reason, with empiricism, which in the scientific method must take the form of experimentation and not just observation. Rationalism versus empiricism. Now, of course, both of them date back to Aristotle as epistemologies, and the relationship between them became problematic or challenging in the early modern period, in the early decades and the first century of the scientific revolution of the early modern period. Apart from the level of substance and epistemology, the third aspect is simply the implications for our worldview of the secularism of the modern age. The notion of materialism, of course, is anything but new. The prime spokesman is Hobbes, but certainly the modern era has brought with it a secular outlook which was unknown in the Middle Ages. And this, of course, poses a fundamental challenge to faith, to religion. And in these three respects, Lampronti and his book epitomize the confrontation between science and religion, reason and faith. I'll come back to this in a moment, but I'll just say something about how I proceeded to advance through this field of early modern Jewish intellectual history. From my initial survey for Professor Tashma, in the course of my study, I encountered a lovely fellow, a delightful writer named Salvador Joshua Segre, who was from Scandiano in the Po Valley, not far from Reggio Emilia, in the Settecento. And he was not very well known. He was only known for one book, which was a polemic against Christianity, That in itself was a little bit of a rarity at the time. And his book was rather well known, although it could not be printed for obvious reasons. So I then spent several years studying this man's career and writing a monograph together with an edition of his book, which is called Asham Talui, Delictum Suspensi in the Latin title. In Hebrew, it's a bit of a joke or a play on words. But he was a fantastic writer. He very personal in his writing. He uses the first person. He wrote something like 80 books, hardly anything published, hundreds and hundreds of poems, rabbinic responsa. He spent his life writing all these things that no one ever read or were published in his small town of Scandiano, a town which even then, one of his correspondents wrote, they'd never heard of, didn't know it existed. So I continued all the while working on Lampronti, and then at some point, about maybe 10 years ago, I began working on the cemeteries in Padova, as was already mentioned. And they, of course, the significance of that project for this purpose, for today, is that my study was longitudinal. The period of the Padova cemeteries runs down from the Renaissance to the Risorgimento, 1529 to 1862. So in short, I saw that it was possible to view the tombstones in Padova, in the cemeteries of Padova, as a tool, a lens, a mechanism for studying the culture of Padova's Jews in the early modern period and into the beginning of the modern period. But that's not my subject today. Now I'll come back to focus on Lampronti and the Pachad Yitzchak. My initial article in the volume it gives details of his career and the qualities of his book, and then focuses on the major feature of his thinking, which is his empiricism. I'll talk about that in a minute. But I would like to say just some general background about his environment, his cultural and intellectual environment. For one thing, he expresses the characteristic of his age, which was eclecticism. This was an age of encyclopedias. It's hardly the first, although in Jewish literature, it is the first. He shares the emphasis that was quite common at the time on reason, on nature. Muratori is of course the prime representative when we talk about Illuminismo. But in Ferrara we have Girolamo Barufaldi, Gian Andrea Barotti, and slightly later Castro Innocente Ansaldi. Specifically, Lampronti's connection is most apparent in his entries about science, where he expresses his vast erudition in the contemporary scientific literature. He was, as I mentioned, a physician. And in fact, not only does he mention this in various places in his book, but in fact, we have correspondence with Giambattista Morgagni of Padova, one of perhaps the greatest physician, professor of medicine at Padova, to whom Lampronti referred some cases in consultation. In terms of his connection to the latest scientific advances. I'll mention just 3 examples. I'll try to be brief. The first was already written about by my senior colleague Ruderman from Pennsylvania. And he writes about one entry in the Pachad Yitzchak, which relates to the notion of spontaneous generation, a notion which was now being disproved by the advances in biology. By the way, a field in which Italy played a leading role. And in the Pachad Yitzchak, strangely enough, this notion becomes relevant for Jewish law purposes in a discussion about whether one is permitted to kill lice on Shabbat. Normally, killing animals on Shabbat would be a problem in Jewish law. And this is where a discussion arose among various scholars, Jewish scholars, about whether this law perhaps was no longer relevant now that the idea of spontaneous generation had been disproved. So this is really a rare moment when you can see the spotlight shine on the cutting edge science of the period. I have to mention, to be fair, that Lampronti makes a very conservative decision. He does not want to change things, even though, of course, he cites the relevant scientific sources on the subject of spontaneous generation, but he is very conservative when it comes to Jewish law. This is something I will talk about later. The second example, which I wrote about at some length, it's also the most exciting, is an entry on a very minor arcane topic of anatomy, which is about the anatomy of a cow, bovine anatomy. And he discusses what it says in the Talmud about the structure of the cow's various trachea, esophagus, and so forth. And there's a statement that it has 3 pipes or channels. And there, Lampronti quotes the interpretation of this idea, of this concept that was given by Rashi in the 11th century, and which was accepted by everyone from the 11th century until his day. And he claims quite strongly that this is incorrect. And for example, believe me, I'm not an expert on the anatomy of the cow, but he says very simply that if you blow into one of the pipes and the air comes out the other, then they are connected. And if it does not come out, they're not. This much science I can understand. But not only does he explain this, he then goes on to, he tells the story about how he demonstrated this empirically before the yeshiva, the rabbinical academy in Mantova. And he says, you try it too. Don't believe me, try it. And they accepted his interpretation as correct, and that Rashi was incorrect. Now, I have to mention that this is an innovation that is purely academic, in the sense that it has no implications for Jewish law. But I think that's interesting because it shows us that in this particular case, we can see Lampronti acting purely as a scientist. It's something that makes no difference in terms of what Jews do, how they slaughter animals and eat them and so forth. This is the case of the 3 pipes. He also has a long discussion of human anatomy. He interprets a text from the Talmud, which talks about all sorts of organs and what they do. And he interprets this text at some length using the latest knowledge of anatomy, again, a field which as a physician trained in Padova, he was quite comfortable and in fact an expert. The last case I'd like to mention is where he talks about fish which are kosher or not kosher. And the one that he has something to say about is called copese, which I think is in Venetian dialect. This is a fish with many names. I've also found it called colpesce, and in English it is a strange name, isinglass. It's a type of sturgeon. Now, there's a lot of literature about the storione. There are articles about it all the time, whether it is kosher, it is not kosher. The simple question about any fish is whether it has scales. It has to have fins and it has to have scales. So Lampronti writes definitively that this fish, the colpese, has scales. And I'm going to quote in English from his text. A number of times I separated the scales with my own hands, and I even threw them before our esteemed yeshiva and before Rabbi Isaiah Bassano, ruler of the Reggio community, Reggio Emilia, in the home of the Lord, Hagvir in Hebrew, Nehemiah Chai ben Moshe Cohen, here in Ferrara. This is a scene straight out of The Godfather, you know, where they see the fish. Here's Lampronti throwing down it's not the fish, it's the scales of the fish in the yeshiva. This is something I would have loved to film or see, but he is so passionate about the importance of empiricism, it's as opposed to the scholasticism of the Middle Ages, which, by the way, was still alive and well at the University of Padova. Morgagni, for example, was in the very awkward position of having to teach the texts, the ancient texts, using Aristotle, using Galenus, and so on, even though he knew them to be incorrect, and he tried to, with all sorts of acrobatics, to tell the truth to his students in spite of the curriculum to which he was obligated. Now, so much for his empiricism. Coming back to the book itself, so it's commonly referred to as an encyclopedia, and that makes sense in the sense that we have alphabetical entries. But in fact, the entries are not like an encyclopedia as we would define it, because what we expect is some sort of very brief summary of the subject, which is actually similar to what the book is actually called originally when it is published in 1750. It's called dizionario, which is a very common word at that time for encyclopedia. And that's what we would expect, but you hardly ever get such a thing. That's not what he's doing. What he does is, for every entry, most of the time what he does is provide a list of references to sources. So it's an excellent resource for someone who wants to study a topic, but he does not take the responsibility of summarizing the subject for you. That's not what he does. So I therefore view his book more as more similar to what today we would call a database. It has all the data you might want, but in unstructured form, mainly in the form of bibliographical entries, although he does other things as well, as I'll tell you in a moment. To understand how this book came about, you have to understand I will tell you what it looks like in its original form. There are a few manuscripts. The one that matters most is the first one, which is located in Paris at the Bibliothèque Nationale. This is, I think it's 135 volumes. And these volumes are almost entirely blank pages. Because obviously what he did is he took a set of notebooks and he labeled them with letters of the alphabet, obviously the Hebrew alphabet. And then over time, he began to fill in entries more or less in alphabetical order. This is a project that he conducted in the yeshiva in Ferrara, and he was not the only one to put in some entries. And obviously this went on over many, many years. And then he felt ready to begin printing. And of course, he did not finish. He didn't get very far before he died. And the project dragged on and on until almost the end of the 19th century. Just to illustrate how this worked, we have an entry in the Pachad Yitzchak from 1728, in which we find a record of a visit to Ferrara of a rabbi from Jerusalem named Moshe Israel. And he says that he came to Ferrara and he went into the yeshiva to look and see what the Pachad Yitzchak says about this particular topic, whatever it was. He knew there was such a book. He knew that it has all these references. It's a fantastic resource. He took advantage of the opportunity to look up something that mattered to him. And in fact, he entered his own opinion, his own thoughts on this subject. So the Pachad Yitzchak for many years was a live, ongoing project of Lampronti to which many other people contributed. And now is the time to mention that one of the great advantages and contributions of this book is the mass of documentation that it contains by rabbinical authorities other than himself, from all over Italy, some from abroad, from other countries, but mostly from cities and towns all over Italy, mainly his contemporaries, sometimes slightly earlier. I don't remember the exact number of rabbinic responsa, but it's certainly in the dozens, if not in the hundreds, material which would otherwise have been lost. This is the only surviving record, the only mechanism for retrieving an enormous library of primary sources by the intellectual leaders of Italian Jewry in the 17th and early 18th century. Now, when he has an entry which is more than simply references, the other material comes after the references. For example, if someone wrote him a letter, or if he wrote a letter on a certain topic, he will include it in the entry after the series of references. These entries, these documentary entries, they can also be anecdotes. They can also be comments and so on. They appear in chronological order. And now you know why. Because the books were kept in the Rabbinical Academy and he would add to them over time, or someone else would add to them. This is why they are in chronological order. He does not emphasize his own contribution. Quite the contrary. His personal contribution to the material is minor. It's minor, and he does not highlight it. He does not give himself more attention, maybe less. I find this characteristic of the man. He seems to me to have been a modest fellow. His life as a rabbi and physician in Italy was not extraordinary. There were many people just like him in terms of their credentials and in terms of their lifestyle. The most extraordinary thing was the only extraordinary thing was the book. So his modesty is quite apparent throughout the book. The book is not a modest book. It's an enormous, ambitious project Nothing like it had happened before. This is stated in the introduction by Jacob Saraval of Venice, who says, no one else in our nation has done such a thing. Everyone understood and appreciated the novelty, the revolutionary aspect of this book. But in terms of his personality, we know what he did. We have, I don't know how many of you have read the new volume from 2017 of essays edited by Mauro Perani on Lampronti and so forth. There's a lovely essay about his family and his life, and so 80, 90 pages or something. Amazing collection of material. And all you basically can conclude is that he led an ordinary life. And he was an ordinary man in terms of how he could have been perceived in society, but not in his mind. In his mind, he was extraordinary. Okay, now this description of the nature of the book is important so that you can understand how I decided to proceed in my own project. Because of what I've told you, you'll now understand that I decided not to write a book about Lampronti, because Lampronti, the man, is not the whole story. In fact, he's a modest part of the story. So I wrote a number of articles about Lampronti himself. That's the first part of the volume. And the other part of the volume is about his world and his society, but not about him. And even the material does not focus so much on him. The articles that focus on him in the first part of the volume, I mentioned already the article on his empiricism, which is a fundamental and important quality, highlighting what was innovative in his own thinking. And then there is an article which I'll talk about in a moment about his visit to Palazzo Te in Mantova. I'll talk about that soon. And then there are two chapters which concentrate on how he understood Jewish culture and Jewish society in terms that we would call historical context. And what I mean by that is as follows. When we talk about historical context, we usually agree that we mean coordinates, two sets of coordinates. We call them sometimes vertical and horizontal, or we mean diachronic and synchronic. So I decided to study Lampronti's outlook on Jewish culture and Jewish society along these two axes, using the diachronic and the synchronic axes. So the first article in this group is about his attitude towards tradition, and specifically the issue of authority. How does he view, what does he think his obligation is, and how much liberty and independence does he feel that he has or that his contemporaries have when they approach questions of Jewish law or Jewish doctrine? And the second article in this group is about the synchronic axis. And here I look at the material he presents in the Pachad Yitzchak about what was going on in Jewish society at the time. For example, the issue of religious observance, and the other focus you can find is about the problem of conversion to Christianity at the time. And I will summarize my conclusions if I take those two chapters together, you can get a profile of what kind of thinker he was. as I hinted before when I spoke about spontaneous generation, you can see him as a conservative man. He tries to be very cautious. He's not a radical revolutionary by nature. This is the way he's very disciplined in this respect. His thinking is conservative, traditional. He doesn't try to rock the boat too much. But this is in theory. This is on the level of doctrine. When it comes to practice, to everyday matters, to the challenges in society, we find that he is quite flexible. He exhibits considerable originality and ingenuity. He's quite creative. He's quite accepting of the limitations of religious observance. He's very aware that there are many instances of conversion to Christianity, including one in his own family. And he doesn't seem to be too troubled by this. I thought that was very impressive, because while we tend to think of these patterns of behavior, meaning a breakdown in observance and a rise in conversion to Christianity, we tend to view them as a terrible threat to Jewish survival. What's impressive here is that he did not view them that way. He viewed them as unfortunate and as something to try to confront. But he did not seem to have a concern that Judaism was nearing the end, that there was a crisis, an existential crisis. There's no sense of existential crisis. And people who talk about la decadenza have to revise their thinking along these lines. Now, when we look at the Jews of Ferrara, his own community at that time, we can find in the Pachad Yitzchak evidence of two opposing tendencies. On the one hand, as I mentioned, you see a certain degree of laxity, transgression, incomplete religious observance. But at the same time, there's a great deal of evidence in the Pachad Yitzchak of piety among the people, expressions of piety, expressions of zeal, profound faith and commitment. And it would not be possible to say that one tendency overshadowed the other. They're both powerful forces. It sounds paradoxical, but it's true. You can find them both in the late 17th, early 18th century, in Italy in general, and in Ferrara in particular. The second part of my volume, I chose to study a handful of topics from the Pachad Yitzchak that seem to have been the most important among the Jews of Italy at the time. And how did I decide which ones were the most important? Mostly by volume. How many pages did they take up in his book? You find topics where you'll have 30 pages, 50 pages. You know you're looking at something which attracted a lot of attention. Usually these will be rabbinic writings, responsa by rabbis from various communities who are all concerned about these problems. So this is how I chose a select group of topics that I thought would give us some indication of what kinds of issues people thought were important, and they had a lot to say about them. For example, some of them are completely unexpected. You would not expect them to be important. There's a long discussion of the practice of people praying to angels, asking them to intercede before God. Now, this is a Catholic practice, but it had also been accepted in Jewish tradition for centuries. There was a debate about it, but it was an old debate, and it's surprising to find that in the early 18th century, this debate explodes. with an abundance of writing. Yes and no, we should continue, it's okay, no, we should stop. And in fact, what is most striking is that now, I think the year was 1727, in Trieste, they've decided to stop it. And that's what's remarkable, the transition to social action. And I talk about that in my article, how I understand it and so forth. And the second problem, which attracted an enormous amount of attention in the Pachad Yitzchak, and obviously in Italy at the time, is a problem that we can call ritual pollution. In Jewish law, going back to the Bible, someone who comes into contact with a corpse is polluted, has acquired ritual pollution, and there is a procedure for purification. Now, there are quite a few laws about how one should handle this problem of pollution. But what happens in Italy in the early modern period is that the problem seems to have gotten out of hand. And the reason for this is architectural. Perhaps I should say urban planning. Because now the Jewish neighborhood is surrounded by a wall and by gates. It's the ghetto. So according to the laws of physics, as they are applied to the problem of ritual pollution can spread if you have spatial contiguity. It can move from house to house. Now, normally that could not happen because there are streets in the way. There are streets separating the houses. But if there is a ghetto, then you have a wall surrounding all of the streets and connecting them so that the pollution theoretically can jump across the street, and then not only the apartment where the body lies is polluted, is contaminated, but we have now I'll use our terms today. We have infection spreading through the air from house to house and street to street until everyone is polluted, and there's no way to stop it. So this is what they are worried about. This also sounds like an arcane problem. After all, there is no real purification anyway. There's no temple, it's all a very theoretical discussion. Why did they even care? But they did care. They went so far that in Venice, one of the suggestions for what should be done is that we should expel all the Kohanim, the Jews who are of priestly descent, because there's no way we can prevent them from becoming polluted, and priests may not become polluted. They're willing, and this is not rabbis who are suggesting this. These are the members of the community council. There's nothing to be done. Let's kick out the Kohanim. It's crazy, but this is something that was happening. And there are lots of rabbinical opinions on what we can try this, we can try that. Some of them are small books. They're so long and complicated and detailed. And they are published in the Pachad Yitzchak. In this section, I also published a paper on the Sambation River, which is the next, it connects to the next question Alessandra wants to ask me.
Infatti volevo proprio arrivare a questo perché, come ho già detto nell'introduzione, appunto, c'è perlomeno diciamo, un contributo che è proprio, cioè che calza perfettamente al tema del nostro progetto di ricerca di Ateneo, che è appunto questo sul The Sambation River and the 10 Lost Tribes in Isaac Lamprontis, Pachad Yitzchak. E appunto magari se puoi parlare un po' di questo contributo, in che modo possiamo mettere in relazione questo contributo con la tematica dell'ebreo errante, e anche in realtà una domanda, diciamo, a latere di questa è se ci possono anche essere elementi degli altri contributi che in qualche modo contribuiscono a, diciamo, a dare un'immagine un po' meno stereotipata dell'ebreo errante.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, first of all, I want to talk about the concept of l'ebreo errante from a theoretical perspective. My jumping off point is a thesis put forward some years ago by Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, who is no longer with us. And he has a short article, not very well known. And there, what he does in this article is to say that exile is not an exception to Jewish history. Exile is the rule. Diaspora is the rule. Dispersion is the rule. This is a perennial, eternal motif in Jewish history. Now, of course, once you think about it from this perspective, it's obvious. If we look back at the Bible, at the beginning of Jewish history, we start with Abraham, the wanderer from Mesopotamia, who wandered into the land of Canaan and then went down to Egypt and back and so forth. He's constantly wandering. L'Ebreo errante starts with the first Hebreo, Avraham Ivri. But, I mean, what's revolutionary in the Yerushalmi's thesis is that he turns this characteristic into something that not only is not negative, well, maybe in Yerushalmi's case it's neutral, but not negative. And I would like to develop it further. In my mind, I develop it further into a positive attribute of Jewish history and Jewish culture. And the first aspect I would like to highlight from this perspective is the image of the cosmopolitan Jew. And I will illustrate this first with a joke. We can lighten the atmosphere a little bit. A man is flying from New York to Japan, and he notices that a few seats away from him on the airplane are these two Jews in that strange outfit with the hat and the coat and the huge beards and so on. And he pays them no particular attention. And then they, at the end of the long flight, they arrive in Japan, and they pass through the passport control, and they get their things. And then he notices that these two fellows are starting to leave the room, and one of them says to the other, Kim shoin, shim shoin, the zin shin shoin. Now, in fact, he was speaking Yiddish, and what he was saying was, let's go, shim shoin. The sun is shining, meaning we're wasting time. But this man, of course, he heard what he heard, and he could not help muttering to himself, those Jews. 5 minutes in Japan, they're already speaking Japanese. Now, this, in fact, is an old story. If we look in Europe, for instance, we can go back to Charlemagne, who sent a delegation to the Caliph, to the Khalif, Harun al-Rashid, consisting of 4 people, and one of them was a Jew, Isaac Yudaeus. 4 years go by, and nothing is heard of these men. Finally, someone arrives from Baghdad, and he says, oh yes, but only one of them is coming back. Isaac Yudaeus is the only one coming back, and he's coming back with lots of presents for Charlemagne, meaning his mission was a success. The others disappeared. No more, nothing more was heard of them. Now, when it comes to a story like this, what we can fill in the background. In the Charlemagne's time, as in later centuries, the Jew had an advantage when it came to wandering, when it came to travel. He could always find someone in his country of destination with whom he could communicate. He could always hope to find a Jew who would know Hebrew. So he was never completely a stranger. And in fact, it wasn't only a question of Hebrew. We find that these Jews in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period and into our own time were very adept at acquiring new languages. Now, the cosmopolitan aspect has implications for the concept of home, which you would think is the antithesis of Hebreo errante. In fact, we find that the Jews in the Middle Ages, almost everywhere they were living, felt quite at home. They did not feel like strangers. For example, in the 1140s, we have a text from the 1140s which describes the foundation of the Jewish community of Speyer in Germany, in the Rhineland. And there, the author explains that the community of that the community of Speyer was founded after a fire broke out in Mainz. And Mainz is described in nostalgic terms. It's called, I'm quoting, the city of our birth, the place of our ancestors. The author is mourning for the loss of Mainz, which forced him into exile to Speyer. He doesn't feel that he's betraying his heritage by referring to Mainz as his homeland rather than Palestine. And no less striking is the conversation reported in the 1520s in Siena. This is a conversation that took place between David Reuveni, whom I'll come back to him in a few minutes, and Ishmael Darietti, the family, very powerful family. So Reuveni asks Rieti, don't you want to go to Jerusalem? He says, no, I'm quoting, I do not want Jerusalem. I only want Siena. Now, Yerushalmi would be very pleased with Rieti, and it would confirm or support his argument that Jews always longed for the land of Israel, but they were fine where they were. And the Zionist agenda has to be taken with a grain of salt, because 2,000 years of Jewish history tell a different story. Now I'll talk about wandering in the opposite direction, wandering not from Italy, but to Italy. This is a story in the late Middle Ages, from the 14th to the 16th century, when there is an influx of immigrants from various countries. It's a well-known story. After the Black Death, they come down from Germany, crossing the Alps. A few decades later, they're fleeing expulsion from France, settling in Piemonte, Savoia, the communities of Asti, Fossano, Moncalvo, and others. Of course, there's migration inside Italy until the Trecento. The Jews are living in the south, mostly. Rome is more or less the northernmost point. after 1300, it's the opposite. Rome is almost the southernmost point, and the new communities are springing up in central Italy and northern Italy. So we have the German Jews, the Tedeschi, we have the French Jews, we have the Italiani who are migrating, settling these new communities. And we also have the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. Some of them come before the expulsion, but mainly after the expulsion. And they come in increasing numbers, leaving their Christian identities in Portugal and settling in various communities in Italy. It's a well-known story, and I'm not going to review it. But this is certainly, if you talk about l'ebreo errante, in the late Middle Ages, 14th, 15th, 16th century, this is where it's happening. And that's the story of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, especially as far as the arrival of the Sephardim, the creation finally of the Livornina, creation of the community in Livorno, which is the strongest community in Italy in the early modern period. Another aspect of this topic, which finds expression in my project, is, I alluded to it before, the Shadar. The Shadar is a rabbi who comes from Palestine to communities in the diaspora to raise money for the people in the land of Israel who need help. Now, I mentioned Rabbi Moshe Israele, the man who was passing through Ferrara and checked what the Pachad Yitzchak says about his favorite topic. And I'll also mention a famous example of the Shadar. It's a rabbi named Ricci, Immanuel Chai Ricci. He actually was originally from Ferrara. He is a contemporary of Lampronti, and he was a well-known Kabbalist. Now he moved to the land of Israel in 1718 when he was 30, at age 30. And he only lived there for 2 years. And then he returned to Italy and he served as rabbi in Florence from 20 to 23. After that, he moved to Livorno and made a living in commerce. Eventually, he went back to the land of Israel in 1735 for 6 years. Finally, he comes back to Livorno in 41. And 2 years later, he's murdered by bandits while he is traveling along the road. Now, Ricci comes up in the Pachad Yitzchak because of a struggle in Florence. In 1724, the community in Florence decides to bring him to serve as their rabbi, but a struggle breaks out because although the vote in the community council passed by a majority, but a minority of voters who opposed this decision was composed of the community's most wealthy members. And they claimed that the decision was not valid since they held the financial power and the responsibility. We're not told what the outcome was of this struggle, but the facts speak for themselves. This struggle was in 1724, and he by then had moved to Livorno, given up his rabbinical position in Florence. So I think, as happens often and in our own time as well, the people with the money talks. The people with the money are the ones who make the decisions. Even more famous than Rikki is Azulai, Chaim Yosef David Azulai, known by his initials Chida, and he left a book of his travels as a fundraiser called The Good Circuit, Ma'agal Tov, including quite a bit of time that he spent in Italy. I've written an article about this, which is not part of today's subject. Azulai enters into today's topic because he too wrote about his visit to Palazzo Te. I already mentioned that one of my articles in the first part of the volume is about Lampronti's visit to Palazzo Te, and I compare his experience and Azulai's experience. And I'll come back to this story in a little while. But now I want to talk about wandering, Hebreo errante, from the perspective of geography and travel. Now, geography is a subject that Lampronti is interested in. He has an entry devoted to the question of where is the Garden of Eden? This was a very popular topic in the Renaissance, during the Age of Discoveries. I've written about it in an article about crocodiles, which I'll mention again in a few minutes. But in this particular entry, Lampronti's problem is that there are two texts from medieval France, they're comments made on the Babylonian Talmud about the Garden of Eden. One of them suggests that the Garden of Eden is, quote, in the west, but then there's one that says that it's in the east, without explaining what exactly they mean. And Lampronti takes it upon himself to try to resolve this contradiction, to harmonize between the two views, which is very nice, and it's something that rabbis have done throughout the Middle Ages, and in his case as well. Another example I'll mention, which I find very interesting for the early modern period, is America. What do people know about America? Lampronti mentions America in his discussion of chocolate. Now, as a rabbi, the question that concerns him is about, it's a very Jewish question. What blessing should one recite before having some chocolate? That's what rabbis want to know. He receives a question on this subject in 1728 from the leading rabbi of Livorno, Malachi Cohen. And in fact, the two men agree that the blessing that is to be recited is the one known as Shakol, that God created everything for his own honor. And that is as opposed to an alternative possibility, a different blessing, which they both reject. Lampronti bases his decision on a statement by the French chemist, Nicolas Lemery. Lemery had written that in America, cocoa is planted to be eaten, not drunk. And that's what dictates his decision about which blessing is appropriate. Now, in fact, Lampronti mentions that Malachi Cohen rejects Lemery's argument. He says that in America, they crush the cocoa, they pound the cocoa, and therefore it makes no difference that they consume it raw, and we in Italy consume chocolate together with water, mixed with water and sugar. He says, makes no difference. And he also says that even though it never occurred to those Americans to drink chocolate, they might have heard about what we do. And maybe they already have begun to do the same thing, or maybe they will do so in the future. Here we have a little bit of ethnocentrism, where Malachi Cohen thinks that, of course, what we do is superior to those wild Americans, but sooner or later they're bound to become civilized. which is an idea one can still encounter from time to time. Now, Lampronti finishes his discussion by saying that he doesn't intend to continue this subject because it makes no difference. As I said at the beginning, Lampronti and Malachi Cohen agree on which blessing is to be recited. So who cares about Lemerit? It's purely a theoretical question. America comes up again in an entry devoted to the possibility of a woman becoming pregnant twice. While she's pregnant, she becomes pregnant again. Now Lampronti quotes Hippocrates, who says that a woman can be impregnated if her vagina is not completely closed, even if she has just become inseminated. Lampronti then refers to the Buffon, Comte de Buffon. He calls Buffon, I'm quoting now, the greatest of the most recent natural scientists. And Buffon tells a story of a case in America in which a woman gave birth to twins. One was white and one was black. And she later admits that on the day after she slept with her husband, her black slave raped her, and so she became pregnant, even though she was already pregnant. This is what Lampronti has to say about America. It's not very different, actually, from what you can find in the book I mentioned earlier by Segre. They know very little, actually, about the colonies, about the American colonies. This is all before the Declaration of Independence and so on. But at least they have some interest. Now that's looking to the West. Now I come to the subject Alessandra already mentioned, the 10 tribes. Now, in fact, Lampronti has an entry devoted to the 10 tribes, and there he's facing a doctrinal problem, because there is a statement in the Mishnah, Sanhedrin, chapter 10, number 3, that states that the 10 tribes will never return. And this statement is considered puzzling, problematic, and threatening. And it requires a solution, a rationalization, and Lampronti offers a number of such solutions, except that I have to add that this is one of those cases where it's hard for us to be sure who wrote this, because oftentimes Lampronti publishes in his book little essays that were written by other people, and that might be true here as well, I don't know. But now I come to the Sambation. Now, the entry on the Sambation in the Bachad Yitzchak is unique for 2 reasons, in 2 respects. First of all, he wrote it in Italian. The book is a Hebrew book, and that's also why it was not published in its place. Only after the entire book was published was this individual entry published in Italian. And the other reason it's unique, or what makes it unique in another respect, is that the article is devoted to bibliographical references, as always, but to sources by non-Jews. And that's unique. Now there's plenty of stuff, lots of literature about the Sambation and the 10 tribes in Hebrew sources dating back to antiquity, but that's not what he is concerned with in this entry. In fact, as I discuss in the article, he publishes this essay, which was created by a younger colleague named Modon, not by himself. He did not do the research himself, but he asked Modon to do it for him, and then he published it. Now, you saw the poster for this session today, with a lovely image of the 10 tribes. I'll just mention where I took it from. It's from the Catalan Atlas, created in the 14th century by Abraham Crescas, a Jew from Mallorca. It's a beautiful source, and it's an example of how maps were created not only with geographical information, but also with all sorts of other information. For example, we have zoological information and ethnographic information and so forth. This is in the 14th century, slightly before the great voyages of Columbus, Balboa, etc. Now, some background about the Sambatyon. In the War of the Jews, that Titus saw a river that is known as the Sabbatical River because it has a strong current on 1 day out of 7. And there's a reference in Pliny the Elder, which says the exact opposite, that it has a strong current 6 days out of 7. The Sambatyon is mentioned in an ancient rabbinic source, Genesis Rabbah. There we have an anecdote. A Roman, Turnus Rufus, asks Rabbi Akiva, what is so special about the Sabbath? It's a reasonable question for a Roman. And Rabbi Akiva answers that God singled out the Sabbath by having the Sambatyon River pull rocks during the days of the week, but rest on the Sabbath as a natural wonder, or what you might call a miracle. Elsewhere in the same text, Genesis Rabbah, Rabbi Judah ben Simon states that the 10 tribes are to be found beyond the Sambatyon River, while the tribes of Judah and Benjamin were dispersed throughout the world. These are ancient sources about the Sambatyon. In the Middle Ages, it comes up in the text attributed to Eldad Adani. Adani means of the tribe of Dan, one of the 10 tribes. Eldad is a 9th century person. His text is largely a forgery, although he no doubt existed. We have other sources. And in his text, it states that the Sambatyon River surrounds the children of Moses. That's what they are called. And that it cannot be crossed on the Sabbath, meaning it's too stormy or too turbulent. Benjamin of Tudela in the 12th century associates the 10 tribes with the Jews of Khaybar in the Arabian Peninsula, and he describes them as independent and warlike. At another point in his itinerary, he reports hearing that some of the tribes are to be found in the mountains of Nishapur in Persia, and they are described as having the same characteristics. Pay attention to the characteristics. They are independent and fierce. Now, this is, of course, an inversion of the self-image of the diaspora Jew as being politically vulnerable, helpless, subjugated, certainly not warlike and fierce. So it's easy to see the image of the 10 tribes as a projection that stands to confront the self-image of helplessness, of powerlessness in this diaspora situation. An extremely influential source is the letter attributed to Presbyter John, Gianni, in the 12th century, 1165, a letter to the Byzantine emperor, which reports that in fact the 10 tribes are his neighbors and that they live in peace, but are subservient to his kingdom, which is a Christian kingdom. Of course, there is a polemical message there that the Jews must remain subjugated until the second coming of Christ. The letter also reveals that stones flow along the sea of sand, that's what he calls it, so that it cannot be crossed for 3 days out of 7. And the sea of sand is connected to the 10 tribes who live beyond the sea of sand. In the 14th century, John Mandeville, the travels of John Mandeville, regardless of, this is the source of the tradition that Alexander the Great isolated the 10 tribes beyond the Caspian Mountains. After this point, the 10 tribes are usually located either in India or in Ethiopia. There is a noticeable rise in the volume of testimony in the 15th century. I'll only mention one source. Rabbi Ovadia Bertinoro, in 1488, travels to the land of Israel by way of Egypt. He is our Hebreo errante in this context. And he says, in Egypt, I'm quoting, "I saw 2 of them in Egypt. They're a little black, but not like Cushites." I'm not sure what Cushites are. I don't know if they're African. I think he might mean African. I'm not sure. And I'm continuing. They couldn't tell if they observed the law of the Karaites or the Rabbinites. This is, of course, the typical Jewish question. When you meet exotic Jews in some unknown country, you have a number of standard questions. For example, we can trace this back to the 10th century. Chesdai ibn Shaprut, the leading political advisor to Abdurrahman III in Cordova, he has a number of questions for Joseph, the king of the Khazars, who is Jewish. And it's always the same questions. Usually what they want to know is, do you know when the Messiah is going to come? This is what Jews always want to know. And if they don't know, maybe this fellow knows. So they always ask this question. So in his case, Bartenura is curious to know, what kinds of Jews are these? Are they like us, or are they some other version? By the way, it is the same text of Bartenura that I relied on in an article I published about testimony concerning the crocodiles in the Nile, because I quote him and Meshulam da Volterra, an old friend of Alessandra's. And in fact, you can trace the history of people's ideas about crocodiles from Herodotus down to the 16th century, to the end of the 15th century. And the point there is that inevitably, there's no other way. This is human psychology. We tend to synthesize and conflate what we actually see with what we know we must see, based on what we've been told, what we've been taught, and our cultural background. So, for example, you can find it in Aristotle, in Pliny, and in medieval commentators, scientific literature, and travel literature. I believe that this relates somehow to the work of Stefano Perfetti, with which I'm not really familiar, but I've seen a reference to a book on medieval and Renaissance commentaries on Aristotle's scientific writing on animals. I don't know if I got that right. Okay, thank you. Now, the most important and famous case of the 10 tribes wandering over to Europe is the man I mentioned earlier, Reuveni, David of the tribe of Reuven, or at least that's how he presents himself. This is in the 1520s. He starts his visit in Venice, travels down to Rome. The story is pretty well known. He then moves on to Portugal And then all sorts of things happen and his journey goes wrong. People can't tell whether he's a faker or telling the truth. Even in Venice, they have him examined by the leading geographer of Venice, who published the Navigazioni. His name escapes me at the moment. The Senate asks him to interview Reuveni and find out whether he's a liar, like Martin Guerre in Davis's monograph. You know, fake identity. My colleague Miri Eliav Feldon has a lovely book on problems of identity in the 16th century. And the Reuveni is a lovely example of this. In the mid-17th century, a new development, Menashe ben Israel of Amsterdam, in his book Hope of Israel, published in 1650, tells the story of a man named Antonio de Montesinos, who discovered the 10 tribes in the New World. I would say this was inevitable, given the discovery of the Western Hemisphere with its indigenous population and so forth. Somebody was bound to come up with this idea. And all of these things are mentioned in Lampronti's essay on the Sambation. I'll only jump to his last entry in terms of chronological order. Augustin Calmet, author of the Dictionary of the Holy Bible, it was published in the early 18th century. The London edition is 1732, and he cites the testimony from the late 17th century of Domenico Magro of Viterbo. And Magro writes that Josephus was wrong about the river flowing on one day out of 7. I'm quoting in English. I saw the supernatural phenomenon and integrated it into my itinerary, adding true authors. Thus, from sundown on Friday, the water weakens and returns to strength on the Sabbath at the same time, meaning there is a 24-hour hiatus in the flow of the Sambation. I'm ready to move on to your third question, Alessandra.
Yeah, sorry.
So, Daraba, thanks so much, dear David.
Yes.
Data l'importanza sia del volume di Lampronti, Pahad Isaac,
avevo ancora una domanda.
sia del libro che ci ha presentato.
Non c'è tempo. Non abbiamo tempo per la terza domanda?
Ma no, io passerei la parola ai nostri ospiti, cioè a Dora Liscia.
Ok, va bene.
Perfetti, perché data l'importanza sia del volume di Lampronti, Pahad Isaac, che del progetto di volume che ci ha presentato per l'appunto David, abbiamo pensato che la discussione interdisciplinare si sarebbe arricchita con un apporto che guarda in particolare al mondo delle arti e dell'immagine. Abbiamo avuto anche quella bellissima immagine che abbiamo messo nella locandina e anche una riflessione sul pensiero filosofico. Quindi se Dora volesse intervenire rispetto a quello che può aver pensato, ma anche a quello che abbiamo sentito.
Sì, buonasera. Io ho letto con molto piacere e molta attenzione l'introduzione e devo dire sono emersi più domande che risposte. Ho trovato alcuni degli articoli su internet e quindi mi sono documentata anche su alcuni dei temi. In realtà avrei dovuto dire, ma vista la densità dell'esposizione del professore, preferisco porre due domande. Uno, se c'è una relazione tra le critiche o i tentativi di cambiare il calendario ebraico con quello che stava succedendo nel mondo cristiano, ossia la trasformazione dal calendario giuliano al calendario gregoriano, perché le date più o meno coincidono. L'altra cosa si riferisce a Bernardino Ramazzotti, che io ho un po' studiato perché nella recente mostra agli Uffizi è stato uno dei protagonisti, perché gli sono grata, perché ha confermato un'ipotesi che avevo proposto, cioè quello che il motivo per cui gli ebrei erano stati condannati alla cencerias e ostrazzeria derivava dal fatto che era cresciuta la richiesta di carta per il boom che l'editoria stava subendo in questo periodo. Alcuni storici mi hanno criticato, io non sono una storica, sono una storica dell'arte, ma nel capitolo che Bernardino Ramazzotti dedica agli ebrei c'è scritto espressamente. Nel libro di Bernardino Ramazzotti, di cui parla anche il professore nell'introduzione, c'è un capitolo dedicato alle malattie professionali degli ebrei. È uno dei libri fondamentali di medicina, perché appunto è è il primo libro che affronta le malattie professionali. È un intero capitolo è dedicato agli ebrei, che è molto interessante perché fa capire anche i mestieri degli ebrei e chi li esercitava, come le donne nel ricamo e nella produzione dei tessuti. Quindi non so se lui aveva visto il ghetto di Roma, che è il più significativo in questo senso. Ma anche a Padova c'erano molte botteghe di cenceria, da cui poi derivarono molti dei paramenti che si trovano nelle sinagoghe. Quindi spunti ce ne sono infiniti, ripeto, io non ho letto Pachadiskak e quindi non so assolutamente più di quanto ho letto in altre fonti, però è una fonte inesauribile di informazioni anche dal punto di vista appunto storico-artistico, e anche questo intreccio forte tra contaminazione tra il mondo cristiano e il mondo ebraico, che si riflette anche in moltissimi oggetti sinagogali. Comunque le domande sono relative al calendario e a Bernardino Ramazzini.
Ok, sul calendario non ho non so da dire, cioè non ho visto discussione nel Pachad Yitzhak su questo argomento. Questa risposta vera e semplice.
Può parlare anche in inglese, non...
Purtroppo, sì. Riguardante Ramazzini, sì, vado a discutere un po' quest'articolo, cioè il mio articolo sul rapporto legami tra Ramazzini e altre persone. Questo è il soggetto del mio articolo e lo metto adesso nel contesto di questo volume. Ma prima vorrei dire una cosa sul nome della fondazione Ambron. Torno all'inglese.
Sì, dovrei parlare io. Ero stata presa dall'interesse. Sì, la Fondazione Ambron ha dato dei denari per questo libro. Io sono nel comitato scientifico della Fondazione e siamo sempre stati interessati appunto a tutte quelle pubblicazioni e a quelle iniziative che coinvolgano il mondo ebraico. Quindi molto volentieri abbiamo contribuito.
But there is also a connection, a substantive connection to the foundation with Lampronti because of the mystery of the name Lampronti. So this is a name that's very strange, and much ink has been spilled in an attempt to understand where it comes from. One of the theories is that it's related somehow to the name Ambron. I don't think so. There are too many components that are missing or different. It's not convincing. Similarly, another idea was Alperon. Also, it's too different. It's not the way names would be distorted in a natural process. So I'm sorry, but Ambron is not Lampronti. However, I'm going to take this opportunity to share with you a hypothesis that has absolutely no basis in fact, no evidence, cannot be published, but at least I can share it with someone, with you. The name was certainly first articulated in Hebrew before it was articulated in Italian, meaning in Hebrew characters before the Roman characters. Now, in the Hebrew characters, there are the vowels. However, if the vowels are not pointed, they can be articulated in different ways. If you write the letter Vav, for example, it can be O or it can be U. That's just an example. And the other example is the letter Yod, which can be E, or in Italy, it can be E. Now, the reason I'm telling you this little philology lesson is because if you take the Hebrew characters and you try out different variations of how it might be pronounced, there's one variation that no one has noticed. And that is, you might, instead of pronouncing it Lampronti, you could pronounce it Lamprunte in French. And Lamprunte means very simply Shaul, which is Saul. So now this would suggest that the origins of the family were French. Now, in fact, that's actually the same theory as the Ambron theory, because Ambron is located in the southeast, not far from the Italian border. However, Lamprunte is an idea that rests on a different philological basis. And the only support I can bring for this wild hypothesis is that I noticed two documents in the biographical article in the Perani volume. The documents are from 1631, before Yitzhak Lampronti. And there we have Emmanuel Lampruntus, and again, it's spelled with a U, P-R-U-N-T, Lampruntus, and Angelum Lampruntum, and De Lampruntis. Now, the fact, the use of these other vowels in writing the surname in Latin leaves open the possibility of this other idea about where the name might have come from originally. Now, I know that the foundation supports the publication of the series L'arte dell'eternità, iconografia, storia e tradizione nei cimiteri ebraici dell'Emancipazione, under the editing of Doraliscia and Giovanni Lambroni. And this relates to my Ramazzini article, which Doraliscia mentioned. This is an article about a project of the same Ramazzini, professor of medicine in Padova, slightly before Lampronti, who is famous, as she mentioned, he is famous as the father of industrial medicine. But my article is about a project that he did, and it wasn't his own idea. He was asked to help with this project by Antonio Magliabecchi, the leading intellectual in Italy at the time. Magliabecchi was also not the originator of this project. This project originates, the father of this project is Wagenseil from Germany, who was interested, he was a Christian Hebraist, and he was interested in Hebrew poetry. So he asked Magliabecchi to send him copies of the texts of Hebrew poems on the tombstones of famous Jews, important Jews in Italy. Magliabecchi asked Ramazzini to take part of this project in his area, the Veneto and nearby. So Ramazzini reports back to him in a series of letters about his progress, including the texts that he found. This is what I wrote my article about. It's a striking story because it's a new idea in Christian Hebraism, where they are interested. Usually Christian Hebraism is about texts from antiquity, from centuries, early centuries of Christianity. But now you have someone who's interested in Hebrew poetry from today, from the 16th century and the 17th century. That's quite striking. Now, Lampronti is not involved, but all of these people are people who he either knew personally or he knew from their writings. Everyone knew Magliabecchi, and Ramazzini was quite famous, and he was from the same university in Padova. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I went on to a project devoted to the cemeteries of the Jews of Padova, and I published 2 books. One of them is a study of these tombstones. The book is called Stones Speak, and it's an interdisciplinary study in which part 1 is a literary analysis of the poetry. Part 2 is a study of the material culture of the tombstone, and part 3 is about the society. And I will just say in one sentence that what this study shows is that these different realms are intertwined because culture is unified. And when we know this, when you study literature and you study art, you are going to find the same trends and concerns and motifs. In this regard, my hero is Panofsky, who created the field of iconology, so that if you want to look at works of art devoted to the subject of time, you have to go back and study Plato, Aristotle, and so forth to see how art and literature and philosophy, basically all of the humanities, are interlocking. Now, I believe, am I right that time is short, Fabrizio? Non abbiamo troppo.
Yes, okay.
I will finish in a minute. I think I will jump to the end.
And then we will give the floor to Stefano.
I will jump to the end and talk about the connection between Ebreo Errante and Fondazione Ambron. The Christological interpretation of the punishment of Cain in the Bible as a prefiguration of the eternal suffering of the Jews in exile obscures the Jewish perspective on their own experience. What do I mean? I'm talking about seeing opportunity in novelty, opportunity to acquire new experiences and knowledge, the opportunity to grow and succeed. From this perspective, we find Jews moving to new frontiers geographically. For example, I mentioned the Rhineland in the 10th century, colonial America, and later Shanghai and Cape Town. And the frontiers are economical as well. The stock exchange, the diamond industry, Hollywood, the Jews moved towards opportunity and towards frontiers. Now, in fact, we find this model in the Old Testament. Jacob, the wandering Aramean, flees with the clothes on his back, and he comes back home decades later with a fortune and a family. His son Joseph is dragged down to Egypt as a slave and becomes the viceroy, controlling the country's resources. In both of these cases and others, the protagonists master the new language and culture of their environment. They create success, political and material, and also a home. A crucial factor is their flexibility, the ability to adapt to the climate, the environment, the circumstances. If I jump forward to our own time, this is the secret of the Israel Defense Forces in combat. They emphasize mobility, improvisation, and this prevails against the strategy of the enemy armies, which is dogmatic and rigid. Now, Lampronti embodies these qualities in the intellectual realm. His book represents the tendency to embrace all knowledge and all experience. He crosses boundaries, l'ebreo errante. He confronts and masters unfamiliar territory. Ultimately, the new becomes familiar and it becomes home. This is the Jewish experience. Geographically and culturally, the Jew creates his home in every environment and is no longer a stranger. I relate to this mindset personally. As a graduate student at Harvard, I had fellow students who knew what they wanted to do from the beginning, and they moved directly towards their dissertation. I avoided this approach because I saw an opportunity to branch out as widely as possible, to take advantage of the opportunity afforded by a superior institution. In the years since then, I've moved back and forth from my primary area of concentration, the culture of the Jews of Italy, to other areas. I've studied and written about medieval Ashkenaz, Franco-Germany, and most recently about travel to Yemen in the 19th century, l'ebreo errante. My tendency has been to follow ideas and motifs where they lead me. I find continuity as well as change. Jewish cultural history has both. It keeps changing and it always comes back home. Thank you very much. Fabrizio, finito. Finalmente.
No, è stato a great pleasure for us to hear your wonderful speech. But now, Stefano, vuoi aggiungere qualcosa?
Prego.
Sì, grazie, molto brevemente perché abbiamo fatto un po' tardi, ma la presentazione è stata talmente ricca, talmente bella che vogliamo dire, l'abbiamo ascoltato con molto piacere. Io ringrazio Fabrizio perché avermi messo in questo panel mi ha fatto leggere con attenzione i saggi di David e il modo in cui si stanno organizzando, no? Allora, mi sembra che nel libro che David sta progettando ci siano due fuochi tematici, leggendo il Pachad Yitzhak. Da una parte le preoccupazioni strettamente rabbiniche, no? Quindi di ridefinire i temi della tradizione halachica in un mondo che stava cambiando. E dall'altra c'è il tema del dialogo scientifico, no? La cultura di Lampronti, ecco. Nel Settecento la scienza non è più un'impresa privata, ci sono le comunità scientifiche ed è inevitabile che il progresso sia attraverso le relazioni e gli scambi. Ora mi colpisce una cosa che David scrive, che dice che Lampronti cerca di integrare la scienza moderna col giudaismo tradizionale come aveva fatto Maimonide nel Medioevo. Ora, il parallelo con Maimonide è suggestivo perché in ogni epoca si presentano alla cultura ebraica delle nuove sfide, nuove perplessità, no? Quindi si deve accettare la cultura contemporanea, sì, ma questo comporta un allontanarsi dalla tradizione, come mettere d'accordo la nuova scienza e le sentenze dei padri. Quindi questo dialogo è qualcosa che si deve condividere con tutta la comunità o soltanto con i propri pari? Perché nel caso di Maimonide, la guida dei perplessi è uno scambio, lo sappiamo, con un allievo, con Yosef ben Yehuda di Ceuta, medico anche lui, quindi persona molto colta. Però ecco, Malkiel qua invece parla di dice che Lampronti ha in mente un destinatario più ampio, parla di popular audience, no? Quindi faccio ora le mie domande perché non la voglio far lunga. La prima domanda è questa: ma vanno davvero prese alla lettera le affermazioni nel frontespizio che parlano di ogni persona alla ricerca di Dio, ogni lettore? Veramente abbiamo una prova che Lampronti parlasse a tutta la sua Keilah, oppure il dialogo era comunque con interlocutori colti? Questo è il primo punto. Secondo punto, enciclopedia. Lampronti scrive una sorta di enciclopedia in un secolo di enciclopedie. L'analogia con l'Encyclopédie e altre opere naturalmente viene alla mente, però il genere letterario non è quello di una encyclopédie, non è nemmeno una Encyclios Paideia in stile bizantino, un corso del sapere, no? L'aspetto erudito, eclettico, mi sembra dominante. Allora, c'è un saggio molto, molto bello che è quello The Burden of the Past, in cui Malkiel scrive che Lampronti non ha un atteggiamento critico verso i sapienti dell'antichità che cerca di integrare, magari ce l'ha nel confronto di Rashi, no? Quindi c'è da una parte la volontà di distaccarsi dalla cultura medievale, dall'altra quella di riagganciarsi al sapere classico. Ma questo non assomiglia veramente tanto al cosiddetto medical humanism, l'umanesimo medico, una tradizione iniziata proprio a Ferrara nel XVI secolo, con un protagonista che è Niccolò Leoniceno. C'è un bellissimo saggio di Vivian Nutton, no? Del 97, The Rise of Medical Humanism in Ferrara. E allora chiedo a David, le domande sono queste, oltre a quella precedente. È corretto dire che il Pacha di Isaac di Lampronti vuole fondere in un solo libro la tradizione dello Shulchan Aruch di Joseph Caro, insieme allo stile enciclopedico del libro naturalistico del XVI e XVII secolo, alla maniera di Gesner e di Aldrovandi? Oppure non è meglio pensarlo come una sorta di Vesalius mit the Talmud, cioè una sorta di reinvenzione dello Shulchan Aruch nello spirito dell'umanesimo medico? Un modello prossimo, ad esempio, non potrebbe essere quella famosa filosofia libera di Isaac Cardoso che Lampronti cita spesso?
Okay, I'll start with the second question. One of the characteristics that I would like to highlight in this context is that science, or medicine in particular, and Jewish law are only two elements, although they are the most conspicuous elements in the Pachad Yitzchak. However, the range of subjects is much broader and nearly universal. In my own database about this project, I mean, I had something like 15 or 20 categories of topics, including language, for example, philosophy, Kabbalah, and so forth. So whatever definition we choose, when we want to characterize it, it must be much broader than medical humanism or Shulchan Aruch. Even though those are the most prominent, that would be an insufficient characterization. And as the first question goes, I think the nature of the book speaks for itself as a new stage in the popularization of knowledge. And again, it's knowledge that spans not only halacha, but meta halacha, all the branches of science, philosophy, mysticism, pietism, everything you want, humanities, and so forth. There is no question that this trend, which began with the invention of movable type with Gutenberg's day, has reached a new stage of popularization. For example, the Avizi, the journalism, and so forth. Knowledge is now available to not only to rabbis. Of course, it's vital that we connect this question to the question of what assumptions we should make about the average person in the Jewish community. This brings us back to the question of la decadenza, which I raised at the outset. And the result, very simply, of my study of Padova, which is a cultural history of early modern Italian Jewry through one mechanism. There's no question that the average person appreciated Hebrew. How much Hebrew he actually knew is debatable. But I'll give an extreme example. Even in the 19th century, when the inscriptions on the tombstones are not only in Hebrew, they're also in Italian, but they won't give up the Hebrew. Hebrew is their national language, it's their heritage. Could they read it? Well, we know a little bit about Jewish education in Italy in the 18th century. And what we know is quite impressive, although it's hard to know how many people in reality had access to these opportunities and took advantage of them. More work obviously needs to be done, but there's no question that Lampronti was not addressing a tiny audience of his colleagues. He wrote an encyclopedia. He wrote it as something that he wanted to see printed, and he wanted to be a resource. I have no doubt that he had a larger audience in mind. In fact, like Maimonides, an international audience. Here, the model is not the Guide of the Perplexed with its esotericism. Here, the model is his halachic work, his code of Jewish law, which he purposely wrote in Hebrew so that even Jews in Europe would be able to read it, so that it would serve as a universal text. You're quite right in pointing the spotlight on Maimonides as a model. After all, he is a fellow physician as well as a rabbi. And yes, the code of Jewish law in Maimonides' case is novel also for the choice of genre. It's a path-breaking work in terms of genre. I find it perfectly conceivable that Maimonides served as Lampronti's model in terms of reaching for a new genre. But the genre of his day was not the code. It was the encyclopedia.
Thank you so much, Beseder. Ma possiamo,
Thank you very
scusami,
much.
Thank you so much.
David, ma tu hai un impegno poi alle 7?
Sì, devo andare al vaccino.
Certo, quindi c'è qualche minuto ancora, ma dal momento che sappiamo in che tempi viviamo, dobbiamo dare anche a David il tempo per andare a fare questa operazione. C'è qualche altra domanda brevissima, magari? Alessandra, vuoi aggiungere qualcosa?
È partita forse?
No, è ancora collegata.
Eccola.
Scusate, ma avevo messo il mouse al contrario e non riuscivo più a rimettere la voce. Vabbè. Ero lì che disperatamente mi aggira. No, non direi niente, più che altro, vabbè, c'erano delle cose che mi sarebbe piaciuto trattare, ma ovviamente ormai il tempo è non c'è più, e quindi niente. No, beh, ecco, magari potrebbe essere un'occasione per un eventuale altro incontro, soffermarsi un po' di più su tematiche come quelle affrontate nel caso di Palazzo Te, per esempio, no? Questo discorso anche che è un po' a metà tra come posso dire, tra l'interculturalismo da un lato, questo aspetto delle arti intesa anche come architettura, cosa che di solito un po' viene, non dico ovunque ovviamente, ma a volte viene un po', no, tralasciata, quasi come se non fosse arte in senso stretto, e quel contributo effettivamente è estremamente interessante proprio per questo discorso di relazioni tra la cultura europea e la cultura ebraica, che appunto non sono due elementi separati. Questa è una cosa che si vede sempre più chiaramente, ma appunto storia, cultura, pensiero ebraico sono poi una parte integrante e integrata della storia, della cultura e del pensiero europeo. Quindi in questo senso, ecco, però ripeto, stasera chiaramente non c'è più tempo, ma insomma meglio così, così abbiamo un'occasione per un altro, per un altro incontro.
Naturalmente abbiamo con noi anche David Palterer, che di Palazzo Te se ne intende, perché ha avuto modo di frequentarlo anche per varie mostre, iniziative. Se vuoi farci un saluto brevissimo, David.
No, prima di tutto è molto molto interessante, è stato davvero, sono contento di aver partecipato. Quello che suggerirei, come stiamo facendo questo progetto, abbiamo un progetto europeo della rete fra le città europee che hanno patrimonio ebraico. Questa conferenza magari dedicata al Palazzo Te, questo confronto e rapporto, se possiamo farlo con CISE e farlo con la provincia e Palazzo Te, comunque di un'iniziativa, e farlo diventare visto che David parla in inglese, potremmo farlo a livello europeo, di invitare tutti i nostri partecipanti, che sono 5 paesi, Spagna, Inghilterra, Germania, i Shum Cities, vuol dire sono entrati in patrimonio UNESCO da questo mese, e sono Poznan, Cracovia e Mantova. Allora sarebbe interessante di farlo, se volete programmiamolo, e potrebbe essere un'altra iniziativa a fare insieme.
We do agree, e come nel caso dell'Histoire des Juifs abbiamo concluso certo, dicendo che la traduzione di questo bel libro curato da Piazza V sarebbe stata in italiano l'occasione di una nuova iniziativa. Così, caro David, ti ringraziamo tantissimo di essere stato con noi. Ti auguriamo buon vaccino, questo è un nuovo augurio natalizio che non fa nessuno di noi avrebbe pensato, però lavoriamo su questa idea su cui Alessandro e David Pater, diciamo, hanno anche aggiunto qualche elemento interessante, per cui per l'anno prossimo, nell'ambito di questo percorso, recuperiamo dal tuo libro sul Hadizak tuo questo tema di Palazzo Te come incontro di culture e anche di arte, letteratura. Sappiamo che complesso e che monumento è Palazzo Te per la cultura europea dell'epoca, e quindi oltre che sviluppare un ragionamento approfondito e multidisciplinare su questo tema, come suggeriva David, potremmo promuovere, David Pater, l'iniziativa insieme con questa Lega, con questa federazione Città Patrimonio dell'UNESCO, e questo sarebbe un fatto che penso che come CISE, anche come progetto breve errante, ci interesserà moltissimo. Quindi con i migliori auguri, che buone feste a tutti, diciamo che abbiamo un appuntamento su cui lavorare. Sei d'accordo, David Malkiel?
Con piacere.
Bene, allora grazie a tutte e a tutti, è stato, penso di interpretare l'opinione condivisa, è stato un pomeriggio molto molto bello, abbiamo imparato tanto e abbiamo materia per sviluppare qualche altra iniziativa. Di nuovo grazie, Todarabà e alla prossima.
Buonasera a
Grazie a
tutti.
tutti, arrivederci.
Grazie.
Ciao.
Grazie,
Arrivederci a tutti.
Ciao.
Ciao Mafalda. Ciao.
Ciao.